Before we get started, YouTube analytics shows that only 6.3% of my viewers are subscribed. As a new and growing channel, every subscription is incredibly impactful. It's free to subscribe, and doing so not only supports the channel greatly, but also helps me reach more viewers. Your support means a lot to me. Thanks for being part of our journey, and enjoy the video. My mind had shattered slowly and methodically into confused fragments and tiny shrieking pieces. I remember days just lying in bed, not eating, staring at the ceiling. I remember the skittering of the shadow people in the corners, but most of all, I remember the voices screaming at me all the time. It was my mother's voice most of all, that insane, enraged cry. "Wet your bed again and I'll cut it off!" She screamed harshly. The voice seemed to come from all around me, shaking the walls and the ceiling, but I was still lying alone in my bed. Logically, a part of myself knew it, but I could still hear her shrieking voice, that lunatic, raspy shrieking. I remember the first time my mother ever caught me stealing a piece of candy as a little boy. She dragged me, crying and pleading, into the kitchen. Then she turned the oven burner on high and grabbed my hand. "This will teach you," she hissed as she quickly pushed my hand down. The screams from that day echoed across the decades. Sometimes even now I still hear them. The door downstairs clicked and jiggled. I felt like a statue in the bed. The ceiling seemed to be opening up into another world, a ragged patch about 7 feet across. It crumbled down, revealing a paradise with rainbows, bright green rolling hills, and puffy clouds beyond. But in this dank place, my flesh body stayed and rotted, surrounded by garbage and filthy dishes with larvae squirming on them. Out of my peripheral vision, I saw policemen and paramedics rushing in, their cold, attentive eyes quickly scanning the room. Mixed in with them, though, the shadow people skittered and wedged. They grabbed me, but I couldn't tell if the hands were the flesh of humanity or the cold void of the shadow people. I looked up at the opening in the ceiling. It seemed to wave me forward. I felt myself floating out of my body toward the land of milk and honey as the blue skies and eternal sunshine beckoned me forward. I glanced back. The shadow people swarmed all over my filthy, broken flesh shell, but I knew that I had escaped their clutches. Working together, the paramedics and shadow beings took my body away. I felt grateful knowing that I had just left behind a fate worse than death. Time passed, but I don't know how much. I lived in the world of forever sunshine, clear streams, and endless forests. I would glance back through the opening occasionally, seeing my body made of meat still lying there. Men in white coats stood among the shadow people in a brightly lit clean room with curtains. The shadow people took their razor-sharp fingers and traced invisible sickness all over my body. Other shadow people gnawed and clawed at the men in the white coats. Their attacks didn't leave physical marks. They were more like radiation. If a shadow person reached inside someone's body and traced its dagger-like finger across their liver, that person would have liver failure within months. I had seen it happen many times before. The shadow creatures attacked me all over, and with each attack, it seemed like I lost more and more of myself. I turned away, sickened. I would always return back toward the land of sunshine and rolling hills, but as I looked around, it seemed more like a prison than ever before. I was alone in these forests, set to wander under the beautiful springtime hills for eternity. Perhaps this place was hell. Perhaps instead of fire, it used boredom to burn, just like a prison. I heard the men in the white coats speaking through the opening that always followed behind me. A rather severe case of catatonia with catalepsy and mutism, one of them with glasses said. He has a prior diagnosis of schizophrenia, but it seems to have gotten much, much worse, he continued. Does he have any past history of catatonia? The bald man in a white coat asked. The man with glasses shook his head, looking grimly down at my body made of meat. The rest of the men looked down with slightly bored expressions. One turned and left the room, jotting something down on a clipboard. No reported history of mutism or waxy flexibility or any other typical signs. The man with glasses responded, giving a low sigh. Well, he's not responding well to the current medicine, so we'll start him on electroconvulsive therapy and continue things for now. We'll also keep the feeding tube. So what are you putting down as the official diagnosis? The bald one asked. The man with glasses wrote something down on his clipboard. Withdrawn catatonia resulting from severe, untreated paranoid schizophrenia, he responded. We have to get an involuntary commitment form signed by a judge. Tell the nurses to rustle up an extra inpatient bed in Psych. He's going to need it. The next few days slipped by as a blur. I watched them wheel my body into a room with lots of machines. They put a robin's egg blue mouth guard with a breathing hole in it beneath my teeth. They rubbed gel on my forehead and started attaching circular electrodes to my skin. The shadow monsters floating around seemed to laugh and dance. They supposedly give ECT patients drugs to put them to sleep, but I saw the whole thing from that other world. Perhaps there are more things in existence than doctors even dream possible. I watched my body jerk and seize as the electricity hit it. I felt myself being ripped from the dream world that I had inhabited. I fell through the opening toward my silent, thin body. It lay there, as pale and still as a corpse. As we rejoined, I thought that I could hear the laughing of the shadow people. Dax, I groaned as my eyes flew open. Time had passed, though I had no idea how much. I wasn't in that surgical room anymore with the kicking, seizing surges of electricity and the doctors who showed far too many teeth in their smiles. Now I was alone. Every part of my body seemed to hurt. My back screamed at me as stabbing pains ran up and down my spine. I sat up suddenly in the darkness, looking around. I was lying on a thin mattress in a room with oppressive concrete walls. I blinked quickly, my eyes adjusting slightly. A thin trickle of light came in through a window with metal bars crisscrossing it. Outside, I saw the bloody red glow of a sunset. Or maybe it was a sunrise. The dark crimson light streamed down through row after row of razor wire and tall, sharp fences. I stumbled out of bed toward the door and ripped it open. Bright fluorescent light streamed into the suffocating grave room. They flickered and strobed, casting eerie shadows that danced up and down the hallway. I didn't see a single person. Empty medical carts stood on the sides, bloody scalpels and knives thrown haphazardly on top of them. One cart had its drawers ripped open, some of them broken off. Inside one of the crooked drawers, I saw dismembered human fingers lined up carefully, like an open package of hot dogs. Used needles and chunks of broken cement littered the gray floors. I also saw splatters of something red and chunks of what looked like a liver. Flies swarmed around them, and a sudden sickly wave of rot reached me as I stood in the threshold. I backed up, nearly vomiting. I retched for a moment, my eyes watering as I breathed through my mouth, trying not to smell the putrefaction. Then I looked back into the room, realizing there was a sign above the bed, one I hadn't seen in the darkness. It looked ancient, covered in thick layers of dust and yellow nicotine stains. I squinted at it, getting closer and trying to read. Rules for patients while inviting psychiatric hospital 1. Do not leave doors open. That invites them in. 2. If you must go into the key room, get out before the guard notices you. 3. You must make an offering of raw meat to the keeper if you wish to pass from one level to another on the stairwell. I stared at the sign for a few seconds, wondering what the punchline was. I looked around, expecting someone to jump out and try to scare me or perhaps announce that this was all a prank and being recorded, but nothing changed. Still imprisoned in this cube of gray concrete with ancient strobing lights streaming in from the hallway, I felt a sudden coldness run through my body. I glanced at the open door, a sinking feeling forming in my chest. For a brief moment in the flickering lights, I thought I saw a pale face with wide, excited eyes peeking around the corner. The fluorescent lights made a tinkling sound as they strobed in the hallway, sending their eerie glare into every corner of the room. "Hello?" I whispered, tiptoeing toward the door. "Is someone—" I was cut off by an eerie, congested breathing, a long, raspy inhalation, as if a corpse with dirt and worms in its throat had just come back to life. My heart raced at 100 miles an hour, pounding hard in my ears. "Dax!" the voice gurgled, calling my name. I heard more ragged, choked breaths faintly echoing from further down the hall. I backpedaled quickly, looking for some sort of weapon, but everything in the room was bolted down to the ground, even the bed. Unless I wanted to try suffocating these elder creatures with a thin hospital pillow, there was absolutely nothing of use in this room. My mind flashed back to the medical cart in the hallway, the one with the scalpel and surgical instruments littered across the top. A long white arm reached around the corner of the door, breathing hard. I put my head down and sprinted straight for the medical cart. It was so close, maybe only 20 feet away, but at that moment, 20 feet seemed like 20 miles. I heard a choked gasp as the unknown creature lunged forward, wrapping its cold, pale arms around my neck. I caught a glimpse of the deep sores eating into its flesh, the way bones poked out through the tips of its fingers. Bugs' red and black gashes dug into its skin. Long black hair fell over my vision, and I smelled the odor of rotting tomatoes and decayed meat. Even though this happened a few days ago when I did manage to escape that wretched place, sometimes I think I still smell that fetid odor in the air, and my heart freezes. "Dax!" It hissed in my ear as its freezing hands wrapped around my neck. "Give me your warmth." I tried throwing the thing off as it squeezed tighter, cutting off my breath. In panic, I thrashed my arms, slowly dragging the corpse toward the medical cart. I reached back and tried to gouge out its eyes, but my fingers kept sliding off the dead, loose flesh. Further down the hall, I saw 3 more pale white figures limping toward the commotion, like moths drawn to a flame. I got a better look at them, realizing they had once been women with long black hair, but now they looked like the walking dead. Deep black gashes ran through their skin, and beige autopsy stitches zigzagged up and down their chests. They wore light green hospital gowns stained with a tangle of fluids I couldn't identify, though much of it was clearly blood. Their eyes had taken on a filmy, faded hue as they limped closer, twitching their heads left and right. I was still too far from the cart, and I knew I had lost. My vision began to turn black as the fingers tightened, the fingers whose skin was peeling off, whose sharp claws of bone dug into my neck. I would have screamed, but I had no air. And then something heavy and fast hit us both, sending us flying. The icy fingers fell from my neck. I looked up to see a giant man with a dark, cross-eyed stare. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving as he looked down at the pale, undead woman who had tried to strangle me. He was wearing the garb of a psych ward patient, a white t-shirt, khaki pants, and slippers. I looked down at myself, realizing I was wearing the same outfit. Someone must have changed my clothes while I was unconscious. With a lunatic gleam in his eye, the man stared down at me, then at the undead abomination in his hand. He gripped a gleaming buckknife soaked with fresh blood. He ran forward. I screamed, but he didn't attack me. With a crunching sound, he brought the knife down into the undead woman's milky left eye. It pierced deep into her skull with a soft crack of bone and a sound like spurting liquid. Her legs kicked and twisted for a few moments as she writhed on the filthy gray floor. Pieces of broken glass and needle tips dug into her loose white flesh. Black blood poured from her wounds, gushing from her head like a waterfall. The man pulled his knife out with a sickening sucking sound, then extended one giant calloused hand toward me. I quickly grabbed it, and with strength like an ox, he yanked me up off the ground. "We need to get out of here," he said in a low, flat monotone, pushing me forward down the hallway away from the other undead women who were only a few steps away. "Run!" Even though my head pounded and I was terrified and confused, I sprinted for my life. The large man was faster than me, and I ended up following him down the hallway. It split left and right, but he seemed to know where he was going. He veered left and pushed open a cracked door around the corner, whose sign read janitorial closet. After ushering me inside, he slammed it shut and turned the deadbolt. We found ourselves in total darkness until he pulled on a string hanging next to a bare incandescent bulb. Its light bathed the small closet in a dim yellow glow. The man extended his left arm toward me. I shook it, wincing as his iron grip nearly crushed the bones in my hand. "I'm Freddy," he said slowly, his voice plodding. One of his eyes stared at the wall while the other looked directly at me. His right hand still gripped the knife tightly, blood dripping from the blade's point and landing on the ground with soft, repetitive sounds. "You must have a death wish leaving your door open like that." "I'm Dax, and I just got here," I said, rubbing my neck where the undead woman's claws had left angry red marks. "I have no idea what those things are, the one in the hallway peeking around corners." Freddy stared at me for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he shook his head. From outside the door, I heard something sharp being dragged lightly across its surface. I imagined those horrific undead women scraping their claw-like fingers against the battered wood only inches away from us. Faint, congested breathing echoed in the silence. "So, I guess those rules are real," I said, breaking the tension. Freddy's face darkened like a storm cloud rolling in. He nodded grimly. "They are as real and serious as death. I don't know who put them up, but they're the only reason I've stayed alive this long. They're in every patient room." "How did you get here?" I asked. Freddy's expression flickered between anger and sadness. "I killed my girlfriend," he said flatly. My stomach dropped. "She was cheating on me," he said, his tone unchanging. "I found her and the guy and shot them both in the head. I remember tracing the exit wounds with my fingers under the moonlight. How still they seemed." His eyes stared 1,000 miles away, but then he abruptly snapped back, letting out a deep sigh. "They found me criminally insane. The nail in the coffin was the—" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "The blood. I drank her blood." I froze, giving him a sideways glance, waiting for the punchline that never came. "You drank her blood?" Freddy nodded grimly, his cross-eyed stare unblinking. "There was a lot going on at the time," he said, rubbing the back of his neck like a nervous schoolboy. "I thought my heart was stopping. I was hearing voices and seeing faces in the trees. The voices told me her blood would heal me, that it would fix all the damage." I swallowed hard as he continued. "So I put a glass under the bullet hole and drank it. I see now that I was sick, that I was wrong. Even if she was cheating on me, she didn't deserve to die. But sometimes things get, well, crazy. And when that happens, I get a little crazy and confused myself. I make bad choices." His voice trailed off, and silence filled the room. Finally, he spoke again, his tone almost wistful. "I've been in nut house after nut house for the last 7 years. They shuffle you around from one place to another. 3 days ago, they told me I was being transferred. I'd been responding well to meds and therapy, they said. They promised more freedom." He clenched his jaw. "But then they brought me here. They drove me in a closed van, no windows. Some guy in a black suit sat in the back with me, silent the whole way. When we arrived, he leaned close and said the strangest thing. 'Remember to follow the rules at Whiting. The danger is real. That's not in your head.'" Freddy's face twisted with anger as he muttered, "And now I'm stuck in this concrete tomb with no way out." From outside the door came the faint sound of dragging again. Freddy cocked his head, listening intently. "We should keep moving," he whispered. It's not a good idea to stay in one place too long. Not here. With that, Freddy unlocked the door. We stepped into the hallway, the oppressive atmosphere immediately pressing down on me again. The fluorescent lights flickered and strobed, casting eerie shadows against the walls. Freddy led the way, his knife gripped tightly in his hand. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The stairwell," Freddy said without looking back. "We'll make an offering and head down to the first floor. There's a cafeteria there. You'll need to eat and drink if you want any chance of survival." The word offering sent a chill down my spine. "You mean to the keeper?" Freddy nodded. "It's not so bad as long as you follow the rules. It won't attack." Freddy led the way down the hall, his footsteps quick but cautious. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional flicker and buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. I felt like every shadow was watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. Ahead, we came to a heavy metal door with the word "stairwell" stenciled in bold black letters. Freddy glanced at me, his face grave. "Remember the rules. We make the offering, and we don't look back." I nodded, gripping the blood-stained folding knife Freddy had handed me earlier. My hands were slick with sweat, and the weight of his words settled deep in my chest. Freddy pushed the door open slowly. It creaked, revealing a dimly lit stairwell that spiraled downward. Narrow slivers of light filtered in through cracks in the doors, and holes eaten into the walls. The air smelled damp and metallic, tinged with a faint sulfurous odor. As the door swung shut behind us, I caught sight of deep scratches in the wood, long curved gouges that could only have been made by claws. My stomach churned at the sight. "Move!" Freddy hissed, his voice low but urgent. Clenching the dismembered hand he had cut from the undead woman earlier, Freddy began to descend the stairs. I followed close behind, every muscle in my body taut with fear. The stairs creaked under our weight, and the sound seemed deafening in the stillness. About halfway down, the air grew colder. I could see my breath fogging in front of me, the mist swirling and dissipating in the dim light. Freddy suddenly froze, his body rigid. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I strained to listen. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it. A deep, predatory inhalation that clicked and gurgled. The sound reverberated through the stairwell, seeming to come from somewhere below us. Freddy turned pale, his eyes wide. He gripped the severed hand tighter, holding it out in front of him like a shield. "It's here," he muttered through gritted teeth. I glanced down the stairwell and caught a glimpse of something moving, a flash of crimson gone in an instant. My heart hammered in my chest. "Just keep walking," Freddy said, his voice trembling. I couldn't tell if he was talking to me or to himself. The railing shook slightly, and I froze, gripping it tightly. Then I saw it. A set of claws, sharp crimson and impossibly large, wrapped around the handrail just ahead of Freddy. The fingers looked like twisted railroad spikes, dark and jagged. Slowly, the creature pulled itself into view. The keeper. It was a nightmare made of flesh, towering over us at nearly 8 feet tall. Its exoskeleton gleamed dark red, the color of clotted blood, and ridges ran across its torso. It had no eyes that I could see, only 2 snake-like slits where its nose should have been. Its head was elongated, its jaw unhinging to reveal rows of teeth that looked more like swords, each as long as my hand. Silver rivulets of saliva dripped from its maw, hissing softly as they hit the ground. It tilted its head, sniffing the air. Then it let out a deafening roar, a sound that shook the stairwell and made my knees buckle. The smell of sulfur and blood filled the air. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused to move. The keeper turned its head toward me, its jaw snapping open and shut with mechanical precision. Freddy acted quickly. He tossed the severed hand onto the steps in front of the keeper. The creature's head snapped down, its jagged teeth gnashing as it tore into the offering. The sound of crunching bones filled the air as blood spattered against the walls. Freddy grabbed my arm and yanked me forward. "Don't stop. Keep moving," he whispered urgently. We skirted around the keeper, hugging the far wall of the stairwell. My eyes stayed glued to the floor, too terrified to look directly at the monstrous creature devouring its gruesome meal. As we reached the next landing, I glanced back just for a second. The keeper's head snapped toward me, and it let out a low, rumbling growl. "Don't look back!" Freddy shouted, pulling me forward. We burst through the door at the bottom of the stairwell, slamming it shut behind us. I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. My entire body trembled, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Freddy wiped his brow, his knife still clutched tightly in his hand. "That was close," he muttered, "but it gets worse from here." We stood in the dimly lit hallway, catching our breath. The oppressive air of the building seemed heavier down here, the smell of rot and decay more intense. Freddy leaned against the wall, his chest heaving as he wiped sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. "We made it past the keeper," I said, trying to steady my voice. "What could be worse than that thing?" Freddy glanced at me, his face pale and grim. "You'd be surprised." He pointed down the hall to a set of double doors with a small frosted glass window in each one. Faint light flickered from the other side. A crudely painted sign above the doors read, "Cafeteria." "Let's get some food and water. You're going to need your strength." We approached the cafeteria cautiously, the soles of our shoes squelching on the sticky floor. The hallway was littered with debris, shattered glass, broken medical carts, and pieces of stained fabric that might have once been hospital gowns. The closer we got to the cafeteria, the more the smell of mold and rot intensified, a noxious wave that made my stomach churn. Freddy pushed open one of the double doors, and we stepped inside. The room was massive, with long rows of tables and benches that had been overturned. Plates and utensils were scattered across the floor, some covered in a black tar-like substance. Orange and red patches of mold grew wild, spreading like cancer over the walls, floors, and even the tables. In the center of the room, a body lay sprawled on the floor. A woman in the same outfit as Freddy and me, blood pooled around her, seeping from a gaping wound in her back. "Oh my God," I whispered, taking a step toward her. "Don't," Freddy said sharply, grabbing my arm. His voice was cold, almost detached. "She's already dead. Let's focus on surviving." But as I looked down at the woman's body, I noticed something. Her chest was moving. "She's breathing," I said, breaking free from Freddy's grip and kneeling beside her. I flipped her over gently, and her eyes fluttered open. They were glassy and unfocused, but she managed to lock her gaze on me for a moment. "Almost got out," she whispered, a faint smile flickering across her lips. Blood bubbled from her mouth as she spoke, and I realized it was pooling in her throat. She coughed weakly, her voice a rasping wee. "The key, it's in the key room," she said, her voice barely audible. "The guard, watch out for the guard." Her eyes widened as if she was reliving a nightmare. "The guard. Oh God, the guard." Her body convulsed violently, her teeth chattering as she gasped for air. Then, with a final shuddering breath, she went still. I sat back on my heels, my heart sinking. "She was trying to escape," I muttered. "She almost made it." Freddy crouched beside me, his face set in a grim line. "Almost doesn't count in this place. If the guard caught her, that means it's still around. We need to be careful." I nodded, wiping my hands on my pants as I stood. "She said the key to the front door is in the key room. We need to get it." Freddy gave a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, and we need to get past the guard to do that. You really think it's going to let us stroll in and grab the key? Do we have a choice? I shot back. He sighed, rubbing his temples. Fine, but first we need to eat. You won't make it far on an empty stomach. The kitchen was in no better shape than the cafeteria. The fridges were filled with rotting meat, clumps of mold-covered dairy, and puddles of viscous liquid that stank of death. Freddie found a jar of peanut butter in one of the cabinets, and we dug into it with our fingers. It was stale and bitter, but it was better than nothing. The water from the sink tasted metallic and faintly soapy, but I drank it anyway, gulping it down greedily. All right, Freddie said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. The key room is just down the hall from here. Let's get this over with. We approached the door to the key room in silence. A large wooden sign hung above it with the words, "Key Room," painted in bold red letters. A bloody handprint was smeared across the safety glass window in the center of the door. This doesn't feel like a good idea, I muttered, my hand tightening around the knife. Freddie glanced at me. In and out, no messing around. Got it? I nodded, taking a deep breath to steady myself. He pushed the door open and we stepped inside. The room was massive, lined with rows upon rows of cabinets. Keys of all shapes and sizes hung from hooks on the walls, glittering faintly in the dim light. The back, Freddie whispered. That's where she said the key would be. We moved quickly, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. At the far end of the room, I spotted a desk with a large steel chain hanging over the edge. Attached to it was a single key, shiny and unmarked. I sprinted toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it, a high-pitched, inhuman shriek that made my blood run cold. The shriek tore through the silence, echoing off the walls like nails scraping across glass. I froze in place, my hand hovering just inches from the key. Freddie whipped around, his knife raised defensively, scanning the room for the source of the sound. From the shadows, something emerged. A humanoid figure in a black night watchman's uniform. Its movements were unnervingly smooth, almost fluid, as if it were gliding rather than walking. My breath hitched as I got a closer look at its face, or lack thereof. Its head was smooth and white, completely devoid of eyes, nose, or any human features. Black veins spidered across its skin, pulsing faintly under the dim light. The corners of its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing two long vampiric fangs glistening with fresh blood. But the most horrifying detail was its hands. The guard raised them slowly, palms facing outward, and I saw the truth. Each hand had a massive eye embedded in the center, the pupils darting wildly, scanning the room. The guard's hands blinked once, twice, then locked their gaze directly on me. It shrieked again, an ear-splitting, high-pitched wail that seemed to rattle the very walls. "Run!" Freddie shouted, breaking the spell. I grabbed the key and bolted, my knife clenched tightly in my other hand. Freddie and I split up, weaving between the rows of key cabinets, the metal hooks jangling and rattling as we passed. The guard moved like a predator, its eyeless face swiveling to track us, while its hands guided it with eerie precision. I could hear its footsteps, calculated and deliberate, echoing behind me as it pursued us. I darted around a corner, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the guard was fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen. It rounded the corner with unnatural speed, its fanged mouth opening wide as it let out another piercing screech. I turned sharply, but my foot caught on the edge of a cabinet, and I went sprawling forward. The key flew from my hand, skittering across the floor. Before I could scramble to my feet, the guard was on me. It slammed into me with a force that knocked the wind out of my lungs, pinning me to the cold, hard ground. Its hand came down, the eye in its palm staring directly into mine. For a brief, horrifying moment, I felt like it was looking straight into my soul. No! Freddy's voice roared from somewhere nearby. In a blur of motion, he lunged at the guard, his knife plunging into its smooth, featureless head. The blade sank in with a sickening crunch, and the guard shrieked, its hands flailing wildly. Freddy didn't stop. He wrenched the knife free and stabbed again and again and again. Black, viscous fluid sprayed from the wounds, splattering across Freddy's face and clothes. The guard's movements grew weaker with each strike until finally, it slumped to the ground, lifeless. Freddy staggered backward, breathing heavily, the knife still clutched in his trembling hand. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice raw. I nodded, coughing as I struggled to sit up. My hands were shaking, and I realized I was covered in the same black fluid. "The key!" I gasped, looking around frantically. "Where's the key?" Freddy spotted it lying a few feet away. He bent down, picked it up, and handed it to me. "We need to move now," he said, his tone urgent. "The guard might not stay dead for long." I didn't argue. Together we bolted from the key room, slamming the door shut behind us. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the silent hallway as we ran toward the front of the building. We reached the main door, a massive reinforced steel barrier with a single keyhole in the center. Sunlight streamed through the small reinforced window at the top, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I saw freedom waiting on the other side. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the key, the adrenaline making it difficult to steady myself. Freddy kept glancing over his shoulder, his knife at the ready. "Hurry up!" he hissed. "We don't have much time." The key slid into the lock with a satisfying click. I turned it, and the heavy door groaned as it swung open, revealing the bright open world beyond. We stepped outside, and the warm sunlight bathed my face. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I took a deep breath of fresh air. Rolling green hills stretched out in every direction, untouched and serene. But when I turned to look at Freddy, he wasn't smiling. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on something behind me. "Dax, run," he whispered. Before I could react, a shadow fell over us, and a deafening roar echoed from the doorway. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. From the shadowy doorway emerged a massive figure, the Keeper. Its blood-red exoskeleton gleamed in the sunlight, and its jagged claws scraped against the metal frame as it stepped into the open. Its head swiveled toward us, its jaw unhinging to let out a guttural predatory roar. Saliva dripped from its sword-like teeth, sizzling as it hit the ground. "Run!" Freddy shouted, shoving me forward. I stumbled but caught myself, sprinting down the hill as fast as my legs would carry me. Behind me, I heard the thunderous pounding of the Keeper's steps as it pursued us. Its roars echoed through the open fields, a sound that seemed to shake the earth itself. Freddy was right behind me, his knife clutched tightly in his hand. He turned briefly, hurling the blade at the creature. It struck the Keeper's chest, bouncing harmlessly off its Ketis armor. The beast didn't even flinch. "It's too fast!" I shouted, glancing over my shoulder. The Keeper was gaining on us, its massive claws digging into the earth as it propelled itself forward. Freddy's face twisted in determination. "Keep running! Don't stop!" "What are you doing?" I yelled as he slowed to a stop. Freddy turned to face the Keeper, spreading his arms wide. "Go, Dax! Get out of here!" "No!" I screamed, but he was already charging at the creature. Freddy's roar matched the Keeper's as he leapt onto its chest, clawing and punching with everything he had. The beast stumbled slightly, but it quickly regained its footing, swatting Freddy aside like a rag doll. He hit the ground hard, but he pushed himself back up, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Come on, you ugly bastard," he shouted, waving his arms to keep the Keeper's attention. Tears blurred my vision as I turned and ran. My legs burned with every step. The hills seemed endless, but I forced myself to keep going, Behind me, I heard Freddy's screams followed by the sickening crunch of bone. The keeper's roars grew distant, and the world around me fell into an eerie silence. My chest heaved as I reached the crest of a hill, collapsing to my knees. I turned back, but there was no sign of Freddy or the keeper. The building loomed in the distance, its cold gray exterior stark against the vibrant green landscape. I could still hear the faint echoes of Freddy's defiant cries in my mind, mingled with the horrors we had faced together. "Thank you," I whispered, clutching the key tightly in my hand. I don't know how long I wandered before a passing truck stopped to pick me up. The driver looked at me like I was crazy when I told him about Whiting Psychiatric Hospital. He didn't believe a word of it, and neither did the police when I tried to report what had happened. But I remember the way back. That place is real, and it's hell on earth. People are still being sent there, unsuspecting victims who will never escape. I need someone to believe me, someone to help shut it down before it claims more lives. And Freddy, he saved me. I owe it to him to try.